Well, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the first noon lunchtime lecture of the season. Our speaker this afternoon is Pamela Wilkinson Fox. She is a preservation consultant, and she's the author of the award-winning book, Farm Town to Suburb, The History and Architecture of Weston, Massachusetts, 1830 to 1980. Her career has included work for the Boston Landmarks Commission and the Rhode Island Historical Society. She's a consultant to the Weston Historical Commission, a member of Weston's Planning Board, its Community Preservation Committee, its Land Trust, and she's president of the Historical Society. Today, she's going to talk to us out of her new book, which she's going to sign afterwards out in the Bow Room. And as you know, it's entitled North Shore Boston, Houses of Essex County, 1865 to 1930. Please join me in welcoming Pamela Wilkinson Fox.
I'd like to thank you for the Athenaeum for inviting me to speak today, and also take this opportunity to thank the staff of the Athenaeum, including Sally Pierce, the curator of photographs. One of the high points of my research was finding an album of photographs here put together by Herbert Brown, the firm of Little and Brown, and it was just wonderful to find that here and use your wonderful collection. Lights, please. I'd like to begin with a whirlwind journey through North Shore history, followed by a discussion of country houses, their owners, and their architects. The color slides that you see today were taken at properties that I've been privileged to be able to visit. Black and white architectural photographs, such as this image of Crowhurst on the book cover, come from dozens of sources, among them 20th century periodicals at the Boston Public Library, institutional collections like the Athenaeum, Historic New England, and Trustees of Reservations, museums, local libraries, historical societies, and private individuals. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of them for their help with making this book possible, and to thank Jonathan Winthrop for writing the foreword, which talks about estate land conservation and its importance to North Shore history and its ambiance. Definitions of what is the North Shore vary by geography and also sometimes perceived social exclusivity. To keep it simple, I have included all 34 towns in Essex County. Beginning in the early 1800s, residents of Boston came to the North Shore to escape the summer heat. The annual migration became easier in 1818 when daily summer steamboat service began operating to Nahant. Nahant was the first enduring North Shore summer colony. The 70-room Nahant Hotel of 1823 was a relatively modest stone structure, but at the time it seemed elegant and a great novelty. Nearby, Boston merchant princes with names like Lawrence, Lowell, Appleton, and Sears bought small cottages. Until the mid-19th century, Nahant rivaled Newport as the most fashionable seaside resort on the East Coast. In 1838, the first train on the newly formed Eastern Railroad made its inaugural run from Boston to Salem. Within a few years, the main line was extended to Newburyport and up to Maine, with branch lines to Gloucester and Marblehead. Gothic revival was the favorite style for the first generation of country houses. This stone cottage was built by Enoch Reddington Mudge on his 130-acre estate in Elmwood in the center of Swampscott. Gothic was considered particularly suitable for country houses because of its compatibility with nature and the rural landscape. In 1845, prominent Boston trial attorney Franklin Gordon Dexter became one of the first of Boston's aristocracy to buy land in the rural, thinly populated eastern section of Beverly. Farmer Samuel Ober thought Dexter's offer for his 20 shorefront acres was too high and sought the advice of one of Beverly's leading citizens, who later recalled this conversation. Here's a Boston man wants to buy my land for $2,000. Tain't worth it. What am I to do? I think he knows what he wants. Let him have it. But it ain't worth it. Never mind. Let him throw his money away if he wants to. Dexter proceeded to build Oberland, a stone Gothic revival landmark considered to be the first of the important summer estate mansions. To create the illusion of a venerable English baronial manor, Oberland's builder was instructed to preserve the moss and lichens on the stones. Boston banker Franklin Haven summered in this frame Italianate house in Beverly. Conservative values and a dislike of ostentation translated into relatively modest houses, at least in the first generation. One 19th century historian compared Beverly to its rival summer resorts in this way. Quote, all along this shore stand the beautiful villas, not huddled in vulgar promiscuousness, as at popular shore resorts, nor drawn up in a showy dress parade, as at Newport, but disposed in the easy attitudes of high-bred company, thoroughly assured of its place in the world. One of the Beverly Railroad stations was christened Pride's Crossing after an old local family of that name. Pride's Crossing and Beverly Farms had no hotel accommodations, making it all the more exclusive to own or be a guest at a Beverly estate. Credit for discovering Manchester has gone to Boston poet and essayist Richard H. Dana Sr., who in 1845 became the first summer resident. By the end of the Civil War, Boston Brahmins controlled almost the entire coast from Beverly through Manchester. Attracting middle and upper class summer residents to remote Gloucester proved more difficult. The Eastern Point Associates envisioned an exclusive colony of shingled cottages. They hired the Boston firm of Appleton and Stevenson to build this stone gate lodge. But as far as society was concerned, quote, civilization properly ceases before you come to Gloucester. It was not until the early 20th century that Eastern Point would hit its stride as a colony of artists and artistic individualists. Although located along the coast, Ipswich was remote from the social life of Beverly and Manchester and differed markedly in feeling. The land abutting the ocean was largely salt marsh, too unstable for building, too shallow for yachting, and a breeding ground for mosquitoes and greenhead flies. In the late 1880s, an enclave of summer residents settled at the upper end of Argilla Road, which runs from the town center to Castle Neck. Hilltop sites in more industrialized communities along the Merrimack River were attractive to successful merchants and manufacturers who were not members of the Boston elite. For example, physician, scientist, and inventor James Nichols built the romantic Weenie Keene Castle in Haverhill in 1873. And Methuen hat manufacturer Charles Tenney built Greycourt, shown here in the distance. Inland towns like Ipswich, Hamilton, Wenham, and Topsfield attracted gentlemen farmers, horticultural enthusiasts, equestrians, and lovers of the hunt. I'd just like to briefly mention some of the largest landed estates with approximate acreage. Appleton Farms in Ipswich, 1,000 acres, Princemere, 1,500 acres in 5 towns, Groton House Farm in Hamilton, 700 acres, Maudsley in Newburyport, 1,100 acres, Willowdale in Topsfield, 1,000 acres owned by Bradley Palmer, and the Thomas Emerson Proctor estate of 3,000 acres, or about 1/3 of the town of Topsfield, part of which is owned now by the Mass Audubon Society. And the largest, Castle Hill, with 3,500 acres. We are fortunate that much of this land is now protected by nonprofit organizations such as the Trustees, by private individuals through conservation easements, and as state park land. In summary, the North Shore offered countless attractions for well-to-do families looking to build country houses. Convenient rail transportation, spectacular ocean views, pastoral farms and wooded hills, not to mention quaint towns with picturesque colonial houses and bustling fishing ports. I'd like to mention an important financial attraction. Until the adoption of the state income tax in 1915, individuals paid local property taxes on both real estate and personal property like stocks and bonds. In 1865, Boston appointed an efficient assessor. Within 5 years, $14 million in taxable property had been transferred to 8 outlying towns where wealthy Bostonians had established country houses. This map from the 1893 Boston Herald shows the tax rates. The shift in assets continued for another half-century, with the North Shore towns of Nahant, Hamilton, Manchester, and Wenham among the favored recipients. Assessors in small towns had every reason to underappraise property in an effort to attract and keep summer residents whose tax money subsidized education and town improvements. The North Shore offered outstanding recreational opportunities. The first generation contented themselves with simple pleasures like boating, walking the beach, and driving carriages along winding country lanes. As time went on, organized sports developed, many associated with wealth and high social standing. Bostonians who summered on the North Shore founded the Eastern Yacht Club in 1870. 3 America's Cup victories in the 1880s brought prestige, and Marblehead became the yachting center of America. For those who preferred dry land, fox hunting and polo combined equestrian skills with spirited competition. By far the most exclusive venue was the Myopia Hunt Club, which first hunted in Hamilton in 1882. The region's first official organized golf club was the Essex Country Club in Manchester, founded in 1892 by North Shore Brahmins. President William Howard Taft summered in Beverly in the 1910s and played golf at Essex County and Myopia. The fact that the North Shore was a favored summer destination for diplomats, ambassadors, senators, and 2 presidents, Taft and Coolidge, added to its renown. At this point, I'd like to look more closely at country house architecture from 1865 to 1930, the period covered in my book. We've already seen 3 examples of mid-19th century Gothic: Elmwood, Oberlin, and Weeniquini Castle. My North Shore book begins with another romantic creation, Ben Purley Poor's Indian Hill Farm in West Newbury, developed between about 1850 and Poor's death in 1887. It would be difficult to find a more picturesque spot than this vine-enveloped estate. Poor was one of the first generation of antique collectors. At Indian Hill, he incorporated architectural fragments to create settings for his treasures. In this slide, we see wainscoting from the old Province House in Boston. Poor's recreation of the New England colonial kitchen, with its abundant array of cooking utensils, influenced Beauport owner Henry Davis Sleeper, who visited Indian Hill in 1912. Queen Anne polychrome stone decoration and shaped gables enliven the stone house at Shark's Mouth, built in 1867 by General Greeley Stevenson Curtis and his wife Harriet, daughter of prominent textile manufacturer Nathan Appleton. Waring von Brunt, architects of Memorial Hall at Harvard, designed the oceanfront mansion. The spacious reception hall had high ceilings, a carved chestnut fireplace mantel, and hollyhock wall paintings done by Greeley's sister. The house has remained in the family and maintains its informal atmosphere and original interior furnishings. The staircase originally graced the 18th century Thomas and John Hancock House on Beacon Hill, which had been demolished a few years earlier despite vigorous protests from early preservationists. The destruction of the Hancock House, shown here, and originally located just a few hundred yards from the Athenaeum, this and other preservation battles in the late 19th century raised awareness of the importance of early New England buildings. As one of the most highly industrialized states in the nation, with a large immigrant population, Massachusetts was fertile ground for interest in America's colonial heritage during the post-Civil War period. Residents looked back with nostalgia for a simple, more harmonious, more visually appealing way of life. For these and other reasons, Boston architects played a leading role in development of the colonial revival style. In 1877, a year after the nation's centennial, architects McKim, Mead, and White took a sketching trip along the North Shore. About the same time, Robert Peabody and Arthur Little sketched their way into New Hampshire and Maine, and Little published early New England interiors. Arthur Little was a member of an affluent and influential Boston family that summered in Swampscott, beginning in the mid-19th century. Little's architectural career undoubtedly benefited from family social connections and his long-term friendships with tastemakers Isabella Stewart Gardner and Ogden Codman, Jr. Little attended MIT's School of Architecture in the early 1870s, but never earned a degree. Later, when we see some of his large-scale houses, we may wish that he had graduated and perhaps gone on to France to study at the École, as did many of his contemporaries. One of the first examples of colonial revival architecture by any architect in any location is the Cliffs in Manchester, designed by the 27-year-old Arthur Little in 1879. Cliffs incorporated colonial details in unusual ways. Notice, for example, at the left, the elliptical fanlight window. The resulting house is a completely original creation. Renewed interest in the colonial also sparked development of the shingle style, which derived its name from the uniform covering of shingles, originally unpainted or stained a rich brown. The style flourished in New England coastal resorts, particularly during the innovative years from about 1879 to the mid-1880s. This example, also by Arthur Little, is called Grasshead and was built for his parents in Swampscott. As he did at the Cliffs, Little uses whimsical details like the lighthouse form and the untrimmed tree trunks supporting the piazza. General Charles Greeley Loring built this 1881 house in Pride's Crossing, designed by William Ralph Emerson, who is considered one of the masters of the shingle style. It was a style uniquely suited to the New England character, understated, with none of the rich decoration of the contemporaneous Queen Anne. This is General Loring in his Civil War uniform. He was an early connoisseur of Egyptian art and archaeology, who went on to become the first director of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Shingle-style houses, like Loring's, were carefully tailored to their sites and blended picturesquely into the natural landscape. They were designed to maximize light and views. Wide porches and piazzas connected indoor living spaces with the outside, all qualities particularly valued in summer resort architecture. Proponents of the shingle style aimed to create a haven where friends and family could relax. Interiors were comparatively simple and casual, like the dining room shown here. Yale architectural historian Vincent Scully, who named the style, spoke of a sense of life enjoyed, in touch with its traditions, but not dominated by them. Craigside in Manchester, considered one of the monuments of the shingle style, was designed by Peabody Stearns in 1883. Shingle-style architects were inspired by the seemingly unplanned, organic quality of first-period structures. The term first period refers here to houses built from the 1600s through about 1725 and often expanded over many generations. Shingle-style architects used the same forms to create modern houses with flexible room arrangements and open plans. Because of its originality and forward-looking innovations, the shingle style is considered one of the high points in the history of American architecture. The open plan of many shingle-style houses is centered on the living hall. In the center sketch at right, you can see a good example with the almost obligatory ingle nook and fireplace. Also known as the reception hall, the living hall was the core of the house and provided a comfortable place to lounge in idle hours. Note also the wild naturalistic landscaping here at Craigside, which was the work of Frederick Law Olmsted. Sadly, Craigside was demolished after less than half a century. Peabody Stearns and Frederick Law Olmsted also collaborated at Moraine Farm in North Beverly, built in 1880 for John Charles Phillips, a Boston shipping merchant. Peabody's contribution was this wonderful, rambling English Queen Anne-style mansion. The house is set on a massive Olmsted-designed terrace that provides a high projecting platform from which to view Lake Wenham. At Moraine Farm, Olmsted put into practice his ideas on scientific forestry, later pursued far more ambitiously at Biltmore in North Carolina. He transformed the overgrazed fields and barren, unproductive cow pastures into a gentleman's country retreat and experimental farm. The terrace leads to a sequestered lawn and sunken perennial garden with an octagon-shaped pavilion, probably designed by Peabody Stearns. Olmsted wanted a pavilion that would be not a mere shelter, but a useful room, this is a quote, large enough for coffee reading or ladies' work, with windows and shutters. Over the years, the house at Moraine Farm has been reduced to one story, but the Olmsted landscape has been restored and preserved through conservation restrictions. The property is now owned by the nonprofit Project Adventure. Before we move on to eclecticism, I'd like to mention the only house on the North Shore designed by H.H. Richardson. Called the Commons, it was built as a summer house for Harvard professor Ephraim Gurney on a high inland hill in Pride's Crossing. Richardson died in 1886 before the house was finished. Architectural historian James O'Gorman has called it a final effort at geological imagery, at American rural architecture in sympathy with the American land. Frederick Law Olmsted, who sited the house, placed it on exposed granite ledge and planted massives of native shrubs. Richardson's influence on his contemporaries is evident in the brick and brownstone mansion built by mill owner Moses Stevens at Osgood Hill, overlooking Lake Cochickawick in rural Andover. The estate is the work of Boston architects Hartwell and Richardson. The Fieldstone Gatehouse at Osgood Hill resembles Richardson's Ames Gatehouse in North Easton. The interior is a good example of a cozy reception alcove within a large living hall. Richardson's goal was to develop a uniquely American style, and his work is often seen as the precursor of American modernism. But his death in 1886 coincides roughly with the beginning of the eclectic movement, which drew on the full spectrum of European architectural traditions. From the 1890s through the 1930s, fashionable architects, many trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, designed period houses for wealthy clients in the Italian Renaissance, Beaux-Arts, Tudor, Colonial Revival, or in this case, French Chateauesque. Well-traveled clients or their agents brought back mantels, paneling, and tapestries to give their new houses the patina of age and taste. The resulting creations were by no means slavish imitations. European models from past centuries often lacked comforts. Skillful practitioners borrowed ideas and details, but adapted them to the needs of the client and the requirements of the site. Grey Court in Methuen was designed by the prominent New York firm of Carrere and Hastings and reflected John Carrere's European upbringing and école training. The Courtyard Arcade, which survived a series of devastating fires, is now the centerpiece of Grey Court State Park. The turn of the century has often been referred to as the Golden Age of Elegance or the Era of Excess, depending on one's point of view. The boom in country estate building after 1890 was fueled by a huge increase in wealth and expansion of the American upper class. Continuing for a moment with French-inspired designs, this is the Beaux-Arts mansion of Frederick Eyre called Avalon, which occupied a prime oceanfront site in Pride's Crossing. Avalon was built in 1905 from designs by the Boston firm of Parker, Thomas, and Rice, and was demolished in 1992. The French-Norman stable at Crowhurst in Manchester was designed by and for Chicago architect Francis Meredith Whitehouse. This charming farm group was built first in 1895, and what I consider a much less successful main house 10 years later. Today, only the stable and this gardener's house remain. One last French chateau, this time from 1913. This is Liliothea, now known as Wick, which is located on the ocean in Manchester. It was designed by R.H. Wambold, an associate of the Boston firm of Bigelow and Wadsworth. This slide shows the original house on the property. By the 1910s, the shingle style was very much out of style. The architect built a wooden shell around the original house here and transformed it into a monumental edifice of brick and Indiana limestone. Also by this time, George Robert White, who was a self-made president of a wholesale drug company, had achieved huge financial success. White was Boston's largest individual taxpayer for most of his adult life and left a fortune to the city of Boston and its medical and art institutions. Today, the house is in excellent condition and is currently for sale, in the event that anyone here would like to recreate the Golden Age lifestyle. The villas and gardens of Italy were the inspiration for eminent Boston architect Guy Lowell, who designed Allen Bank for a Canadian shipping magnate. Characteristic Italian Renaissance features include the stucco walls, hipped roof, wide overhanging eaves, and red terracotta roof tiles. Bryce Allen's house is now owned by Endicott College. Another fine Italian Renaissance summer house, this one on Marblehead Neck, designed for Henry Adams Morse in 1915 by Boston architects Coolidge and Carlson. An observer of the local architectural climate at the turn of the century noted that Boston clients particularly liked anything suggestive of historical English types, clothed in Elizabethan, Georgian, English country, or American colonial detail. He observed that, quote, your average Bostonian is a man of conservative methods and of conservative mind, who would go on producing what he was accustomed to. This slide is of the Jacobean style Moseley Hall in Ipswich, built in 1894 by James Howe Proctor, designed by the young Manchester architect Ernest Machado. It was reportedly named by Proctor's bride, who, on first seeing the house, remarked that it was Moseley Hall. Great interior shot here. The estate is now, this is the stable of Moseley Hall, which later burned and was replaced by the current stable. At present, the estate is owned by New England Biolabs, which has restored the mansion and built their company headquarters nearby, which you see on the left. A little bit close. But they have beautifully restored the mansion and the other outbuildings as part of the greatest, what Ipswich calls the Great Estate bylaw, which allows for different land kinds of development. The Garland House in Hamilton, built in 1897, is similar in style. The original interiors were wonderfully overdone, perhaps reflecting the fact that the owner, Jack Garland, was a New Yorker. This is the other side of the Grand Hall. A second floor was later inserted into this huge space. Note that the style of interior rooms could run the stylistic gambit. In other words, if you built a Jacobean house, that didn't mean you had to stick with that style on the interior. In this case, in the Garland house, you have a French-inspired music room. And this is the fireplace mantle that Garland liked so much that he took it with him when he moved. This also is the Garland house, which was later called Brackenside and also Fox Hollow. It was designed by Bigelow and Wadsworth, and the well-preserved house is still a private residence. English manor houses also provided the inspiration for Turner Hill Farm in Ipswich, begun in 1900. It was designed by North Shore native William Gibbons Rantoul for Charles Goodenough Rice, whose wife Anne was the sister of James Howe Proctor of Moseley Hall. The site plan shows the entrance forecourt on the north and a terrace and formal garden on the south side. The formality of the plan reflects a marked shift in landscape treatments, which took place at the turn of the century. Rather than responding to natural surroundings, sites were re-engineered to accommodate expansive terraces and lawns. Trainloads of topsoil were brought in to reshape the rocky outcroppings that earlier generations had found so appealing. Here's an early view of the terrace and garden. Today, the 300-acre property is being developed as a country inn within a luxury resort and 18-hole golf course. Decorative half-timbering in the Tudor style was used at Highwood in West Manchester, built in 1896 for a Chicago investment broker by the Boston firm of Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge. Here we see the original owners, Louise and William Walker. Highwood was demolished in 1954 and replaced with a one-story modern house. The 1950s was not a good time for these estate houses, which represented everything that modernists disliked. We see another example of 1950s changes in the next house. This is the Rocks, the 1903 West Manchester mansion of Eben Dyer Jordan, Jr., whose father established the Boston dry goods firm of Jordan Marsh and Company. In addition to developing Jordan Marsh into a major department store, Jordan was responsible for the building of the Saxon, now the Cutler Majestic Theater, as well as Jordan Hall and the first Boston Opera House. He used Boston architect Edmund Wheelwright to design his house, which is another wonderful example of the Tudor style. This is the main staircase, all right, off the huge hall living room. In the mid-1950s, the third floor was removed and the house was modernized, as you can see here. Remarkably, the Rocks was completely restored in the late 1990s on both interior and exterior. This is a slide of it today. Turning to America for inspiration, McKim, Mead White designed this Manchester house for Thomas Jefferson Coolidge in 1902. A descendant of Thomas Jefferson, Coolidge wrote that his design was inspired by old Portsmouth and Salem houses, Virginia mansions of the Jeffersonian type, and English models. The Grand Brick Mansion was demolished in 1958. The Trustees of Reservations now owns the site on Coolidge Point, and the original perimeter of the house has been outlined with stones set into the lawn. Bostonians of Puritan ancestry gravitated towards the colonial and its myriad associations with family heritage, aristocracy, tradition, and simple virtue. Some blue-blood families treasured 18th century and early 19th century country houses like the Lindens in Danvers and Oak Hill in Peabody. Old houses could also be enlarged and remodeled in the manner of Glen Magna Farms, which you see here, where in the 1890s, Little and Brown took an existing federal period house and added a third floor and wings to create a hybrid of old and new. For those of you looking for a Sunday outing, Glen Magna is a place where you can experience what has been called a cheerfully Marie Antoinette-ish version of an old New England farm. This is the famous Samuel McIntyre Tea House that was moved to Glen Magna Garden in 1901. The main house and formal gardens have been beautifully preserved by the Danvers Historical Society and the land and outbuildings by the town of Danvers. At Beauport, collector and interior decorator Henry Davis Sleeper reinstalled architectural fragments from many New England houses. Sleeper's celebrated Pembroke Room, also known as the Pine Kitchen, was widely imitated outside New England for its cozy, romantic feeling and has been called the quintessential colonial room. You will recall, I hope, the similar slide from Indian Hill at Benjamin Purley Poor's West Newbury estate. Although the Beauport Pine Kitchen is perhaps the ultimate colonial revival room, Beauport itself cannot be placed in a simple stylistic category. Over 27 years, Sleeper continually remodeled his oceanfront house, turning it into a labyrinth of 40 rooms filled with American and European furniture and decorative arts, arranged in theatrical compositions that balance light, color, and form. Each room at Beauport has a name and a historic, literary, or aesthetic theme. This is the popular Golden Step room, painted in white and sea green colors. And of course, Beauport is now owned by Historic New England and can also be visited. Going back to the colonial revival, at the Stevens Coolidge House, Ashdale Farm, owned by the trustees of reservation and open to the public in North Andover, restoration architect Joseph Everett Chandler transformed a simple mid-19th century Italianate house into a graceful Georgian brick-ender. New colonial houses could also incorporate woodwork and paneling from earlier homes, as was done at Long Hill, now the state headquarters for trustees of reservations, and also at the 1921 Topsfield estate mansion called Huntwick, which you see here, where John Saltonstall used woodwork from a house that had belonged to his ancestors. In what is perhaps the ultimate tribute to the American colonial, Florence Brown Bratenahl designed a mansion in the first period style and engaged Henry Davis Sleeper to carry out the theme on the interior. This is still standing in Gloucester. When her house appeared in House and Garden, the magazine writer noted that in everything Mrs. Bratenahl did, she tried to visualize the conditions of those early days and the actual environment in which the early settlers found themselves. Of course, the house still included all the rooms essential to the modern country house. Returning to Arthur Little, we've seen two of his early houses, Cliffs and Grasshead. This and the following slides are of Sunset Rock in Pride's Crossing, built in 1897. By that time, Little had formed a partnership with Herbert W.C. Brown, who brought to the practice an expertise in garden design and an extensive architectural library purchased on his travels to Italy, France, and England. Little himself also took extended trips to Europe in the early 1890s. The firm's subsequent houses reflected these experiences as well as a general movement towards the formal and neoclassical. An examination of Little and Brown's account books, now at Historic New England, provides insight into the firm and the reason it was so popular among wealthy clients. Because of Little's flair for interiors and Brown's expertise in gardens, the partners could design a home, supervise construction, and take care of interior decoration, furnishing, and landscaping. Little maintained an album of furniture designs and decorative details, many custom made for specific clients, and he traveled to Europe to find antique pieces. The account books reveal a careful accounting of costs, including the precise costs per square foot. This house was demolished also in the 1950s, and a modern house built, which you see a little bit up to the left, but the stone terracing does remain. At the turn of the century, Little and Brown designed neighboring houses in Pride's Crossing for three wealthy businessmen from outside New England. Swiftmore, shown here, for Chicago meat packer E.C. Swift. Rock Marge for financier and speculator Judge William Henry Moore. Joseph Garland called this a grand central station of a mansion. And Eagle Rock, built for steel baron and art collector Henry Clay Frick. These out-of-towners viewed Little as a respected insider who could be counted on to produce something impressive. Judge Moore seems to have been more interested in his stable. Here he is with, shown with one of his carriages. And here's his stable where he kept his 38 thoroughbred horses. Moore was nicknamed Judge because of his keen eye for horses and lucrative financial deals. His questionable business practices and stock watering resulted in the collapse of the Rock Island Railroad stock and his arraignment by the Interstate Commerce Commission. Something that didn't just start happening recently, I guess. Of the three resulting mansions, Frick's was by far the most expensive, costing more than $1 million. Despite the wealth of the clients, the three houses revealed difficulties in organizing large-scale building programs, perhaps due to Little's lack of academic training. Frick marked his estate boundary with a long, elaborate fence reputed to have cost $100,000. The fence is seen here in front of the Frick stable, which has been converted to condominiums. The house itself was demolished in 1969. These houses had very elaborate interior rooms. This one is at Eagle Rock. And these are several rooms at Swiftmore, which had a really wonderful interior. And here we have Henry Clay Frick. The contrast in attitudes between these men and the Boston aristocracy is exemplified by a storied negotiation between Miss Catherine Peabody Loring and Henry Clay Frick, who's shown here. He bought land adjacent to the Loring compound, hoping to improve his situation by acquiring some beachfront. The Pittsburgh magnate offered Miss Catherine Peabody Loring $1 million for her land and house. According to reports, the granddaughter of Charles Greeley Loring calmly turned down her neighbor, replying, "Goodness, what in the world would I do with $1 million?" Criticism of these newcomers centered on their lack of social standing and lack of taste in architecture. From one reporter's vantage point, the lack of social background was reflected in overblown mansions and gardens. This is a quote. "The Midwestern settlement on the North Shore has not yet established itself as in any way socially important, and the houses which it occupies show the influence of this inferior social standing. Although owned often by very rich people, they are obviously tentative and impermanent, as if their owners were not particularly well established, while frequently they are, at least in their interiors, decidedly pretentious in effect." So we can see what Boston thought of these guys. Richard Crane Jr. and his wife Florence proved that Midwesterners could indeed have great taste. Crane was a Chicago industrialist who acquired his initial wealth from his father's Chicago brass foundry and later expanded into high-quality domestic plumbing fixtures. I'd like to devote a little bit of time to Castle Hill because it's among the finest country houses in this country and because the house, outbuildings, and estate land have been so well preserved under the ownership of the trustees of reservations. In 1909, after several summers in the fashionable Manchester resort favored by his wife Florence, Richard Crane purchased Castle Hill Farm in remote Ipswich, where he eventually accumulated almost 3,500 acres. The first Castle Hill mansion, shown here, was completed in 1912 from designs by Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge. The nationally known Boston firm had designed Crane's Chicago residence. Here they built a 60-room, 200-foot-long Italian villa. It had stucco walls and a red tile roof. But the house did not please Florence Crane, who complained that it was cold and drafty. According to local legend, her husband promised that if she didn't like it after 10 years, he would build her a new house. What is important to remember is that although the house was torn down and replaced, most of the 21 outbuildings and major landscape fixtures that we can see today at this estate were designed for the first house. Among the 1910s outbuildings were the casino complex, which you see at the bottom of the hill in the foreground here, with bathhouse, saltwater swimming pool, and bachelor quarters for guests, all located partway down the hill. After consulting with an expert on model farm buildings, the architects developed an extensive farm group which looked like something out of Tuscany, with stucco walls and green tile roofs. The initial site plan terracing an Italian garden shown here and the maze were designed by Olmsted Brothers, under the direction of Frederick Law Olmsted, Jr., son of the eminent 19th century master. And this is the maze, which is no longer there. And you can see the background view out to the ocean that they had originally in that direction. Arthur Shercliffe, who was a contemporary neighbor of Crane, was responsible for subsequent landscape projects, including the magnificent 160-foot wide Grand Allée and the Rose Garden. In the 1920s, 100 gardeners and caretakers arrived daily to tend the grounds. The Italian villa was replaced in 1924 to 1928 by the present Great House, designed by Chicago architect David Adler. It followed the footprint of the original house. Adler was a master of eclecticism who took his inspiration from the past while providing clients with every modern convenience. Castle Hill is based on two 17th century English country houses, one of which inspired the entrance facade and the other the ocean side. Adler purchased carved limewood Grinling Gibbons overmantel, which you don't see here, but those of you who know Castle Hill probably know the beautifully carved overmantel. He purchased this in England along with 10 paneled rooms and a staircase. And of course, the bathrooms reflect the best of the Crane Company plumbing fixtures. At the same time that the Cranes were building the Great House, quite a different kind of eclectic masterpiece was under construction in Gloucester. Abbadia Mare, popularly known as Hammond Castle, has been called one of the truly unauthentic architectural anachronisms of the North Shore. Here we see the medieval-style drawbridge, which leads into the stone castle. John Hayes Hammond Jr. was the son of a wealthy and famous gold mining engineer and a successful inventor in his own right. Hammond called it fortunate that his architect, Harold B. Willis, was a friend, stating that, "I changed my mind constantly while the work was going on." Hammond spent 3 years combing Europe for the Roman, medieval, and Renaissance architectural fragments, which gave his abbey by the sea its old world aura. Yet another facet of eclecticism. This is quite the opposite from the careful planning of David Adler. The resulting fun and fanciful creation has also been preserved as a museum. In conclusion, of the 51 houses featured in North Shore Boston, 16 are no longer extant, including High Wall, the Pride's Crossing house of Oliver Ames. 18 are still private residences. For those who like English Tudor, Stillington Hall in Gloucester is also for sale. 4 houses are owned by state or local governments. This is Willowdale, the home of Bradley Palmer in Bradley Palmer State Park. Has been under restoration. I'm not sure whether that's continued or not. 10 of the 51 featured properties, including the unique Methuen estate called Pine Lodge, are owned by institutions including schools, churches, and nonprofits. Three are owned by businesses. Penguin Hall, built in 1929 and now the Wenham headquarters of Mullen Advertising, gets my personal vote for the most livable. Like the colonial and federal houses of Marblehead and Salem, these grand houses are an important part of the North Shore architectural heritage. I could not include them all in this lecture or in the book, but I hope that research and preservation efforts will continue into this extravagant and diverse period in our architectural and social history. Thank you very much. Questions? I'd be happy to take a few questions if anyone, or if your questions are more of the nature of did you include my house on such and such a street? I could answer those in the back later, but more. Yes.
Did the firm of Herder Brothers play a role
The-
in designing the interiors? The Herder Brothers?
Herder Brothers. The question was, I didn't hear the whole question. So,
Did the firm of the Herder Brothers
yes.
out of New York play much of a role in the interior design of these buildings?
The question is, did the Herder Brothers, which is a design firm in New York, play much of a role in interior design? I know that they did the interiors of the Frick Mansion, Eagle Rock, and I did not see any documentation of them doing any other houses. Yes.
Did you mention the Sears Castle estate?
The Sears Castle. No. This is the kind of questions that I dread. I just have to.
I'm sorry, I think it's not Sears, it's Searles.
Searles. Oh, yes. Well, Searles is a Pine Lodge in Methuen. Yes, that is in my book, and I didn't talk about it today because it's one of those that there's too many to talk about, basically. But it's a very interesting estate that was founded by Edmund, I believe it is, Searles, who owned a property in Methuen and used the architect Henry Vaughan to design a lot of his houses in the English and Tudor and various kinds of Gothic revival buildings that he has there. Quite a melange, actually, of buildings, which is now owned by the one of the Catholic orders of nuns and used for their schools, various high schools, Montessori daycare centers, and that sort of thing. I was privileged to be able to tour it, and it's really quite a place. Really unlike any other, because it just evolved in kind of a very unplanned way, I guess it's one way of putting it, and but full of wonderful buildings. I have to say that one of the things that's kind of interesting is that as these estates were the period when people wanted to maintain these estates was drawing to a close in, say, the 1920s. That was an era when the Catholic Church was gaining in wealth and prominence, and a lot of these estates were bought by the Catholic Church and preserved in that way, and then in recent years they have gone on to have other uses.
On the preservation issue, how many of the towns have a policy now to try to protect these big houses? I know in Manchester, because of the idea of trying to protect single-family use, a lot of houses were destroyed because they couldn't be turned into condominiums. You mentioned Ipswich as having a great mansion policy. How many towns do?
They're the only ones that I know of. It's called a great, I forget the exact way that it's a Great Estates Development Bylaw, something like that in Ipswich. And what it does is allow for different kinds of development if they have a certain amount of property and if the developer preserves the historic buildings. And it's been used at Moseley Hall so that this because otherwise they wouldn't have been able to build this large commercial building in there, but because of this bylaw they are able to do that. At Turner Hill they were able to build the condominiums and resort, and because they are restoring the mansion. And there's one other one which will come to me, I hope. Anyway, that's not, the other towns, I don't believe, have done that. And the preservation is sometimes a problem. And I did hear of a case in Beverly where people tore down a house because they did not want it to be bought by one of the colleges there, and which has purchased a lot of these buildings. There's two schools, as you probably know, the Landmark School and Endicott in Beverly, and going into Manchester, and they have bought and preserved a number of these houses, and I think that's of some concern because of they go off the tax rolls. So it's not an easy preservation issue because of the size of these houses and because not everyone wants something of that size and that complexity these days. So, but as far as I know, the Stillington Hall and Wick, which are for sale, have to be single-family houses. So, oh, back here, excuse me. Yes. That's at what's called the Stone House at Shark's Mouth. It's in Manchester, and it was built not too long after the demolition. The house that I refer to as it's the Thomas Hancock house, and then went later to his nephew, I believe, John Hancock, the one that was demolished in 1863, I believe, and the house at Sharksmith was built not too long after that, using that staircase, which is still there now at Sharksmouth.
I just wondered if that's the same one. Some years back, I was with a group of architectural historians.
Yes. Yes.
Manchester by the city.
Yes.
This is Olmsted.
Yes, that was that. Yes, that is the house.
All right, thank you very much. Because she said that was she showed us the staircase and said it was it's still backwards or whatever.
Oh. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Go ahead.
I'm curious, how were those houses
How were they
heated?
heated? I actually, I don't know specifically about these houses, but I know from my research in Weston, they often had heating in outbuildings and pumped the heat in through underground pipes into the house. I actually can't say, but I'm sure it was expensive even then. I mean, I think you wonder. You mean actually that I guess I guess they were mostly forced hot air, but I'm actually not. This is not my specialty. Well, they were summer houses initially, a lot of them, although some were built as year-round houses. I would say of the houses that I featured, maybe, 2/3 were built as summer houses and the other third as year-round houses. So, thank you very much, and I'll answer more questions in the back.